Dare to Prevail Part 4, Parallel World, Book 5, written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Chapter 42. My heart sank at Nick's words. There was no denying that Falcon's father was involved. Not if the idea of selling the drug-laced power bars to the entire populace had originated with him. Nick went to the door of his office and poked his head out. "Paul, can you bring Falcon in here?" He did, and then Falcon and I were alone with Nick. "Tell me about your father," Nick said to Falcon. "He's a complete jerk," Falcon said, his lip curling slightly. Nick watched Falcon closely as he spoke. "How so?" Falcon held up his fingers and ticked off reasons. "He took me away from my mother when I was 13. He prevented me from seeing her after that, even when she was dying. He used his enforcers to control me until I was old enough to leave home." Falcon glanced at me. "He threatened Raven and Hummingbird, forcing Raven to agree to betray you." Falcon glowered at Nick. "Is that enough?" "I remember hearing about your mother's death," Nick said, "and the fact that Hart had become estranged from his son. From you." A grim expression crossed Falcon's face. "That's one way to put it." Nick studied Falcon like he was trying to decide if he believed him. "Morgan tells me you don't think your father is involved with the plans to sell the drug-laced power bars to the public." "No, I don't," Falcon said, but his voice showed his uncertainty. "I'm afraid he's very involved, Falcon." Falcon glanced at me, then he faced Nick. "What do you mean?" "I'm sorry to tell you this, but he's the one who thought it up. He's the one who wants to gain control over everyone's behavior." Falcon shook his head. "No, he wouldn't do that." Nick's jaw tightened. He pulled open a desk drawer, took out a sheaf of papers, then spread the pages out in front of us. "These are printouts of email correspondence that I managed to get on Saturday. Correspondence between your father and a few other people in his organization." He tapped the paper. "Read it for yourself." Falcon and I leaned forward and began reading. It didn't take long for the truth to become crystal clear. Once Russell Hart had come up with the idea of putting drugs in the power bars, he'd swiftly moved forward with their development and production. Falcon sat back in his chair, then rubbed his forehead as he shook his head. "I'm so sorry, Falcon," I said, as I placed my hand on his arm. As much as I'd grown to hate Secretary Hart, he was still Falcon's father. When Falcon turned to me, his eyes were dull with disappointment. "No, Raven. I'm the one who's sorry. I'm sorry that you got caught up in all of this. You and Hummingbird." We sat quietly, then Nick said, "Why do you call her Raven? And who's Hummingbird?" "Glad for the change of subject," I said. "When we met Falcon, Amy said we should have nicknames too. She's Hummingbird." Tears pushed into my eyes at the memory. "She came up with that name herself. She said it's because she's small and fast." "And your name?" I smiled sadly. "That was her idea too." I closed my eyes and thought, I can't fail Amy. I have to save her. "Morgan?" Nick asked. I opened my eyes and found him watching me. "She'll be okay," Nick said. I wasn't sure I believed him, but I nodded. "How did you find out?" Falcon asked. Nick and I both shifted our attention to him. "How did you find out that I'm Jacob Hart?" That was the first time I'd heard him refer to himself by his actual name. It didn't sound right. To me he was, and always would be, Falcon. "I didn't know for sure," Nick said, "but you confirmed my suspicions." "What made you think that he might be?" I asked. "My security cameras photographed both of you. I had my security team search the internet for any similar images of Falcon." Nick half smiled. "They found only one. It was a picture of Falcon with his father. It was dated over a year ago." Nick reached into his desk and set the photo in front of us. Falcon glanced at it, then nodded. "I remember that night. I'd gone with my dad to some awards dinner, but later I found out that my mother had been on her deathbed while we'd been laughing and having a good time." A muscle moved in his jaw. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive him for that." Falcon shoved the picture back across the desk as if he didn't want to have anything to do with it. "You should be aware that my father knows where this house is." Nick looked at him sharply, then he turned to me, a question on his face. "It's true," I said. "When I made the deal with him, I told him I didn't know how to get back here. He said not to worry because he had the address." Nick's eyebrows rose. "I wonder why he sent you then." "I wondered the same thing, so I asked him. He said you sweep for bugs every day, so he needed me to get inside to get the information for him." Nick's gaze shifted to the side as he murmured, "He always was crafty." Something in his tone caught my attention. "Do you know him?" Nick turned back to me. "I did, long ago." That was unexpected. "You know my father?" Falcon asked. "Yes, we were in the enforcement academy together." "Wait," I said, shocked. "You are an enforcer?" "Was an enforcer," Nick said. "I haven't been one for a number of years." Falcon threw his hands up. "Whoa, wait a minute. Let's start from the beginning." Nick softly chuckled. "Like I was starting to say, Russ and I were in the academy together. After we finished and began working, we stayed in touch. We both did pretty well, but he rose in the ranks faster than I did. One day, I started a new job at a federally assisted thinning center, and guess who was my boss?" "My father?" Falcon asked. "That's right. At first, we got along fine, but after a while, the culture among the enforcers at that fat center began to change. They became abusive toward the people who had been sent there. I didn't like it. I expressed my concerns to your father, and he promised to do something about it. Turns out he was only placating me because nothing changed, and when I filed a formal complaint, he had me fired." Nick frowned. "That was over 10 years ago. After that, Russ saw to it that I only got the worst assignments. He'd made friends in high places, and eventually he began working for the secretary of the enforcement department." Nick paused. "And now he's the secretary," I supplied. Nick nodded. "That's right." "When did you stop being an enforcer?" I asked. "Right around the time Russ became the secretary." "Why did you quit?" Falcon asked. "I knew what kind of a man he was, and I didn't want to work in an organization that he headed." Nick's lips pursed. "In fact, I knew I had to do what I could to put an end to the way he ran things. Who better than someone who was intimately familiar with the way things were done?" Nick gazed at the two of us. "Things have gotten much worse in the years your father's been in charge, Falcon." A blush rose on Falcon's cheeks. "There's nothing you could have done about it," Nick added. "But there's something you can do about it now." "What?" Falcon asked, his voice tense. "What can I do?" He glanced at me before meeting Nick's eyes. "Whatever it is, I'll do it." Chapter 43. Nick focused on me. "How are you supposed to get information to Hart?" I told him about the log behind the bus stop where I was to leave a message. Nick slowly nodded. "Good, good." "What about Amy?" Worried about what Hart would do to her once Nick revealed the proof that the government was preparing to basically drug the entire populace. I wanted to discuss Amy before we went any further. "We need to get her back," Falcon said. I turned to him, my body tense. "But how?" "You'll trade information for her release," Nick said with a smile. Thrilled I wasn't on my own in solving this critical issue, I relaxed as I looked at Nick. "Okay." "He's not stupid," Falcon said. "The information will have to be good." "Believe me," Nick said. "I know your father is a brilliant man." He smiled. "And so does he. Perhaps that will be his undoing." "What do you mean?" I asked. Nick's eyes met mine. "I'm sure he's been extremely careful to make sure no one finds out about his plans ahead of time. He wouldn't want to rouse any suspicion that these delicious new power bars are anything other than a better version of what people love to eat now." I thought about the power bars that everyone ate. Low-calorie, tasty, with some sort of appetite suppressant in them. They even sold them at school. What would keep people from happily snapping up the new ones, especially if they tasted better? They would eat them, and then it would be too late. Many people would be addicted. "What do we tell him?" Falcon asked. Nick nodded once, then he outlined the bones of the plan he'd come up with. When he was done, I felt better about our chances of getting Amy away from Hart. "I'll wait to release the proof until Amy is safely in our hands," Nick said. I smiled. "Thank you." Hart wasn't expecting a message from me until the next day, so we spent some time drafting the brief message we would leave for him. Then Falcon and I spent the afternoon speculating on how Nick's plan would go. The next day after breakfast, I stuffed the note to Hart into my pocket. Then Falcon and I went out the back door. Even though Nick was well aware of what we were doing, he told us that he wouldn't be surprised if Hart had his house under surveillance to make sure Falcon and I weren't followed when we delivered the message. We had to make it look like we were sneaking out. Falcon and I opened the gate that led to the front yard, then crept along the side of the house until we were near the top of the driveway. Pausing to make sure no one was around, I imagined Enforcer Monroe watching us and felt a shiver race across my flesh. "I think we can go," Falcon whispered. I nodded. Then we hurried down the driveway and began the half-mile walk to the bus stop. It didn't take long to reach it. We quickly found the log and the box Hart had promised would be there. The neighborhood was deserted as Falcon opened the box and motioned for me to give him the note. I pulled it out of my pocket and read the message scrawled in my handwriting. It said, "Nick implied something big is on the horizon. I have no idea what he means, though. He won't tell me anything." "Raven," Falcon said, drawing my attention away from the slip of paper in my hand. I handed it to him, then immediately began to worry that Nick's plan would never work. "Okay," Falcon said, after he tucked the box back into place. "Let's go back before someone sees you." His words were a reminder that Hart wasn't the only one I needed to worry about. Regular people were a potential danger to me. Anyone could recognize me and call the enforcers, then claim their reward. I pulled the hood of my jacket tighter around my head as I fell into step beside Falcon. When we were safely inside Nick's house, we went straight to his office to report on our short mission. "I'm supposed to get his reply tomorrow," I said. Nick nodded. "The waiting can sometimes be the hardest part." That was an understatement. The next 24 hours dragged by, but when I read Hart's reply as I stood beside the log, my breath caught in my throat. It said, "Find out what's going on. Get me something tomorrow, or Amy goes to Camp Stonewater." My heart kicked in my chest, my worry for Amy cranking up. I glanced around the area surrounding the bus stop. Was someone watching us? Was Hart? "What does it say?" Falcon asked. I handed it to him and waited for his reaction. He read it quickly, then he touched a lit match to the corner. When the flames approached his fingers, he dropped the burning piece of paper to the ground, and once it had burned to a crisp, he kicked dirt over the ashes. "We have to get Amy," I whispered. "We will," he murmured. Then he guided me away from the bus stop and back toward Nick's house. My resolve to get my sister strengthened, and when we got to Nick's, we told him what the note said. "He must be worried," Falcon said as he glanced at me. "Why else threaten Amy?" "You're exactly right," Nick said. "Your first message was cryptic enough that he can't tell if I have something big planned or if I'm on to him." He chuckled. "That must be driving him crazy." With my focus solely on what would be best for Amy, I asked, "What are we going to tell him?" Nick smiled, and then he took a sheet of paper and wrote something on it. He handed it to me. "You're going to write this." I read the words I would need to transcribe into my own handwriting. It said, "A man came to Nick's house. I didn't hear what they talked about, but Falcon recognized him. He says the man works for you, but he can't remember his name. I'll check for a note from you later today to tell me what I should do." I lifted my eyes to Nick and smiled, then handed the sheet of paper to Falcon. "This will drive him insane," Falcon said with a grin as he set the paper on Nick's desk. "That message," Nick said as he tapped the piece of paper, "will set the hook. He'll be desperate to know who in his organization has betrayed him." Nick was right. When Falcon and I returned to the drop-off point later the next afternoon, I read Hart's note with trepidation. It said, "Do whatever is necessary to find out that traitor's name. I want to know who it is ASAP. The moment you have the name, call 555-4834. If you screw this up, I'll hand Amy over to Holly myself." "He wouldn't do that," I said to Falcon. "Would he? He's just trying to scare me, right?" "Yeah," he said, although he didn't seem convinced. "I'm sure that's all it is." "Can you remember the phone number?" He grinned and tapped the side of his head with one finger. "Photographic memory, remember?" I snatched the paper from his hands. "Okay, what's the number?" Falcon recited the number, and I handed the paper back to him. "Perfect." He grinned. "You doubted me?" I laughed, which dispelled some of the tension. After burning the message, We began the walk back to Nick's. "I'm surprised he wants us to call him," I said. "Isn't he afraid Nick will find out?" "I don't think that's his main concern right now." "I don't want to talk to him." "You have to, Raven. It won't be the same if it's coming from me." I knew he was right, but the thought of what I was going to have to say to him, to demand of him, made my heart pound. Chapter 44. "You've done well," Nick said, when we told him what Hart wanted us to do. "It was you," I said. "You knew what would get to him." Nick laughed. "That's true." "How long should we wait to call him?" I half wanted to get it over with, and half wanted to postpone it as long as possible. "We'll wait until tomorrow night. The longer we wait, the more keyed up he'll be, which will make it more likely that he'll cave to your demand." Hopeful that Nick knew Hart as well as he seemed to think he did, I nodded. After dinner the next day, when it was time to call Hart, Falcon and I joined Nick in his office. Nick shut the door, then motioned for me to sit in his leather chair. "Here," Falcon said as he handed me a slip of paper where he'd written the phone number. "Thanks." I set the paper beside the phone, then looked at Nick and Falcon. "I don't know if I can do this." "You have to," Falcon said, "for Hummingbird." Amy, I thought. I pictured my little sister. She had a feisty streak, but that would do nothing against the torture tactics Holly wouldn't hesitate to employ. "Okay," I murmured. Then I picked up the phone, my palm slick with sweat. "Here goes nothing." I punched in the phone number. "Hart!" a voice barked after only one ring. It's me," I said. He released a whoosh of air. "Finally!" I heard the desperation in his voice and knew I was in a position of power. At least I hoped I was. "Let's make this short and sweet," he said. "Do you have his name?" "Yes." "What is it?" My eyes went to Falcon's face and then to Nick's. Both watched me closely. "I want Amy," I said, my voice steady. "What do you mean? You want to talk to her? She's not here." "No, I mean I want her back. I want you to let her go." He laughed, the sound sharp in my ear. "No way!" "If you want the name of the man who works for you, the man who's betraying you by helping Nick and his resistance work against you." I let the statement hang in the air, giving Hart a moment to remember the stakes. "I'll only give you his name after you've given Amy to me." Hart swore violently. Then he said, "You'll give me the name or I'll hang up this phone and escort Amy to Holly within the hour." I closed my eyes, imagining the terror Amy would feel when she came face to face with Holly. A gentle touch on my arm brought me back to the present. I looked at Falcon, who stood beside me. He mouthed, "You can do it." My lips flattened with resolve, and I nodded. "If you hang up without agreeing to give me Amy," I said as my heart raced, "then Falcon and I will warn Nick, and then we'll disappear. You'll never find out who it is." It was dead silent, and I feared he'd hung up. "You drive a hard bargain," he finally said. My eyes widened, then a smile curved my mouth. I looked at Falcon and nodded, trying to convey that our plan was working. "When and where do you want to meet?" "Tomorrow morning at sunrise, at the bus stop. Make sure you're not followed." He paused. "And Morgan, you'd better deliver." "I will." He said nothing more, and I knew he'd hung up. I set the phone in its cradle, then repeated the conversation to Nick and Falcon. "I can't believe he went for it," I said as I slumped into Nick's leather chair. Nick smiled. "I can. He demands absolute loyalty, so I'm certain he's taking this alleged betrayal personally." "I'll have to give him a name," I said, thinking ahead to the next day when Amy would be back with me, safe. "Any ideas?" Nick asked Falcon. After a brief hesitation, Falcon said, Seth Robertson." "Who's that?" "One of the enforcers who kept me from seeing my mother. He works really closely with my father now. I'm sure he must know about the plan with the power bars." "What does he look like?" Nick asked, then glanced at me, "in case Hart wants you to describe him." "Good idea." "Let's see," Falcon said as he sat beside Nick. "He's just under 6 feet tall, muscular, shaved head. Oh, and he has a tattoo of a dragon on his right forearm. That should be the clincher." "Seth Robertson," I said. "Shaved head, dragon tattoo. Got it." As the next morning approached, I became more and more nervous. What if Hart didn't show? What if I gave him the name Seth Robertson and he knew I was lying? What if he didn't bring Amy? As it turned out, I was worrying about the wrong thing. Chapter 45. After a lot of arguing, Falcon and I had persuaded Nick to leave his house while we met with Hart. Fearful that Hart would send enforcers to capture Nick while we were gone, we wanted to make sure he was kept out of their hands so that nothing could prevent him from eventually releasing the proof he'd gathered. Though Nick had finally agreed, he'd wanted to send 2 of his men with us, but I was worried that if Hart saw them, he would leave without giving me Amy, so I refused. With high hopes that Amy would be with us soon, Falcon and I arrived at the rendezvous point an hour before sunrise. After finding a good place to hide, a place where we could see if anyone approached the bus stop, but no one could see us, we waited for Hart to arrive with Amy, and waited and waited. It was fully light, and the only person we had seen was a woman walking her dog. And that had been soon after we'd arrived. Now we were just cold and getting impatient. "Maybe they're waiting for us to show up," Falcon whispered. "What are you suggesting? That we go sit on the bench, right out in the open?" Stress made my voice sharper than I'd meant it to be. "Maybe," Falcon said, his voice calm. The idea of exposing myself to whomever might be watching and waiting kind of freaked me out, and I pressed myself closer to the tree I was hiding behind. Had I been hasty in refusing Nick's offer to send 2 of his men with us? "I'll go out there," Falcon said. "Once I make sure it's safe, then you can come out." "But I don't want anything to happen to you." "Someone has to make the first move, Raven. If you want to get your sister back, we have to do this." I couldn't help but think that Falcon must be wondering what had happened to the Morgan he saw in that video, the one he admired, the one who was brave. Unhappy to know I would never be duplicate Morgan, I frowned. I was me, and there was nothing that would change that. "Okay?" he asked. I kind of grimaced. "Okay." "I'll signal to you when it's safe," he said. Then he stepped out from behind the tree and walked toward the empty bench that was 30 feet in front of me. I watched him settle himself on the metal seat, then rest his elbows on the back of the bench. Nothing moved. 5 minutes passed, and just when I began to feel a rush of irritation with Hart for taking so long to show up, I caught movement to Falcon's left. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, but a hand clamped over my mouth and a familiar jolt of electricity blew through me. My body went limp, but not before I saw a man in an enforcer uniform burst from the foliage and rush Falcon. Falcon must have seen him coming, because he leapt from the bench and shouted, "Raven, run!" I saw the man tackle Falcon, and then my attacker put something over my head, because I couldn't see anything after that. He also bound my arms behind my back before tossing me over his shoulder like a large sack of flour. Helpless to fight back, I strained to hear what was happening, but all I heard was scuffling in the distance. I was shoved head first into what felt like the back seat of a car. My worst fears had come true. I'd been captured by enforcers. Terrified as I was, I didn't wish any harm to come to Falcon, and I hoped with all my heart that he had managed to get away. I was the one Hart wanted. I was the one accused of murder. Falcon had only been helping me. The car started, and we began to move. Desperate to know who exactly had taken me and where we were going, all I could do was endure. The effects of the taser started to wear off, but between the bag covering my head and the restraints around my wrists, I could do nothing but wait. I don't know how long we drove, but by the time we stopped, my body was fully functional, and I geared up for a fight once my captor opened the door. But to my surprise, he opened the door near my head instead of my feet, and when he pulled me out, he wasn't alone. I had no chance to fight for my release as more than one strong pair of hands gripped my upper arms and kept me from running away. No one spoke as they practically dragged me along. I couldn't see a thing and hoped they were taking me through a clear pathway. A metal-sounding screech indicated a door being pulled open, and as we moved forward, I could feel that the space was smaller. We were inside a building. Was it Camp Stonewater? Was Holly going to take over? Absolute fear rose within my body, climbing, until it crested. "Let me go!" I screamed. No one responded. "Please," I begged. As hysteria began to overtake me, the pitch of my voice rose. "Please let me go. I haven't done anything wrong." I began to whimper. "Please." Another door opened, then I was forced to sit in a chair. My wrists were released, but only long enough to bind them to the chair in which I sat. Then cuffs tightened against my ankles. The cloth still covered my head, and now I couldn't move at all. My heart jackhammered and my ears began to ring. It was hard to tell for sure, but my vision seemed to be narrowing to pinpoints. Dizziness swept over me, and I hoped when I fainted I wouldn't hurt myself, because I knew I couldn't stop myself from passing out. What seemed like seconds later, although I knew I must have passed out for longer than that, the cloth was yanked off of my head. I squeezed my eyes closed against the sudden bright light, but forced them back open, frantic to know what was happening and who had me. "Hello, Morgan," Secretary Hart said as he stood in front of me. Chapter 46. Using my terror to fuel my words, I spoke through gritted teeth. "This wasn't our deal." His eyes locked with mine, and he barked a laugh. "You didn't really think I would take orders from you?" Too afraid to speak, I stared back. "Either you're more stupid than I thought, or you think very highly of yourself." Trying to anchor myself, I glanced around the room. To my right was a door. To my left was a table, and beyond the table was a large mirror/window. No one else was in the room with us, though I wondered if anyone was watching from the other side of the mirror/window. The room looked exactly like the one DM had been in when Holly had tortured her. With that realization, another bout of dizziness threatened to sweep over me. Hart snapped his fingers in my face. Snap, snap. "Pay attention, Morgan." My eyes shot to his as he squatted in front of me. I was tempted to spit in his face. "Now," he said softly, "tell me who's been meeting with Nick." "Where's Amy?" I forced my voice to show strength that I was nowhere near feeling. Hart's nostrils flared. "Answer my question first." That was not an option. Once I told him what he wanted to know, I would have zero leverage, but holding back that information would come at a price. "Can you do this, Morgan?" I asked myself. "Can you stay strong?" I imagined what I was about to put myself through and began to tremble. "No," I whispered. Hart sighed. I tried to distract myself with other questions. Had Falcon gotten away? Was Nick safe? Where was Amy right then? "Why do you want to do this to yourself?" Hart asked. "Just tell me what I want to know. Once you tell me, you'll be free." A smile spread across his lips. "Free to go home. Free to live your life without my men looking for you." His voice softened. "What do you say?" The man knew how to make a fantastic offer, no doubt about it. But something didn't feel right, and I wondered if he would even keep up his end of the bargain. After all, capturing me and bringing me here wasn't what he had agreed to the day before. Besides, the whole, "here's the name of the man who's betraying you," wasn't even true. No one had betrayed him at all, and the moment he discovered I was lying, he would punish me. Regardless, I had to know that Amy was safe. "Bring Amy in here first," I said, my throat like sandpaper. Hart's lips pursed, then he stood, before turning and striding out of the room. Where was he going? Anxiety traveled from the top of my head all the way down to my toes, and I knew he would never let me win. He left me alone for a long time, long enough for me to work myself into a state of high agitation. He's going to come in here with Holly, I thought. He's going to let her torture me until I tell him what I know. I won't be able to stand it, and I'll end up telling him all of Nick's plans. The door swung open, and my gaze snapped in that direction. Hart entered the room, alone, then closed the door behind him. He sat in a folding chair across from me and stared at me without speaking. Unnerved by his unwavering gaze, I clamped my mouth shut so I wouldn't say something by mistake. "Amy will be here soon," he finally said. Relief cascaded over me as worry over Amy receded, until a new obstacle took its place. What would happen when I told Hart that Seth Robertson was the betrayer and he found out I was lying? When a brief knock sounded at the door, Hart smiled at me. "That must be her." Keeping his focus on me, he tilted his head and called out, "Come in." My eyes went to the door, and when it opened, I saw Amy being escorted by a man I'd never seen before. She jerked her body as if trying to get out of the tight grip he had on her arm. "Amy," I said, "are you okay?" "Yes," she said. Then my eyes went to the man beside her. Bald and muscular, he had a tattoo on his right forearm, a tattoo of a dragon. I held in a gasp as my eyes widened. Seth Robertson. He looked just like Falcon described. What was he doing there? "Put her in that chair," Hart said, pointing to a chair several feet from me. Robertson shackled Amy to the chair, then he stood against the wall. "Your sister is here," Hart said. "Now tell me what you know." Before I had a chance to open my mouth, Amy spoke. "Don't tell him anything, Morgan." "Shut up," Hart said, while keeping his eyes on me. "Morgan?" "Don't do it," Amy urged. Hart huffed out a sigh, then he looked at Robertson. "Tape her mouth shut." "Yes, sir." Robertson left the room, returning with a roll of duct tape. "Don't do that," I said to both men. Robertson ignored me, ripping off a piece of tape before pressing it across Amy's mouth. "You disgust me," I said to Hart. He sneered at me. "Yeah, I get that sometimes, and it really hurts my feelings." My fear of him began to evaporate, replaced by anger. I wanted to make him suffer. "I can see why Falcon loathes you." My eyes narrowed. "You're the worst father ever." He flinched, ever so slightly. I'd touched a sore spot. "Enough!" he shouted. My voice dropped to a near whisper. "I'm not going to tell you anything." He stared at me. "Are you sure about that, Morgan?" I hesitated, then slowly nodded. He glanced at Amy, then looked at me. "We shall see." Then he stood and gestured with his head toward Robertson. "Come with me." The second they left the room, I turned to Amy. "It will be okay." Silently, she stared at me, her eyes shiny with unshed tears, her wrists and ankles bound to the chair. After a moment, she nodded. What was I doing? I had Amy. Why was I defying Hart? I should just give him Robertson's name and get it over with. Maybe I could make a deal with him. The name of his fake betrayer for my and Amy's safe release. I didn't have to prove anything to him. I pictured duplicate Morgan and how she had done all within her power to stay true to herself. The memory gave me strength. Hart left us alone for a while, but I was certain he was standing on the other side of the mirror/window, waiting for me to reveal something in a conversation with Amy, for me to crumple in fear, for me to call out to him. But I did none of those things. I held my position in my chair, not that I could move, and waited for him. Finally, he returned, but he was not alone. He brought Josh Mills and Holly. Chapter 47. "You remember Holly Bennett, I presume?" Hart asked, as he swept his hand in her direction. I tried to nod, but my neck had become stiff with fear. "This enforcer may look familiar as well," he said. "He was there when you were last questioned by Miss Bennett." "Tortured, you mean," I thought. Though I knew it was actually DM who'd been tortured, what had happened to her felt so familiar to me that it might as well have been me. My gaze shot to Mills, and I thought, are you going to stand by and let her torture me? I knew he'd done it before, so there was no reason to think he would blow his cover this time. His eyes met mine, then he walked out of my line of vision, presumably to stand against the wall. "Hello, Morgan," Holly said as she approached me. "Welcome back to Camp Stonewater." With reluctance, I looked at the person from Duplicate Morgan's history that I'd been the most terrified of meeting. She stopped in front of me and stared down at me, absolute fury on her face. "Your behavior has been unacceptable," she said, her voice deceptively soft. Then she leaned close. "Your escape made me look bad. I don't appreciate that." She straightened, then she smiled at me. "Don't worry, you'll make it up to me very soon." Dread like I'd never felt before flooded me, but in my helpless state, all I could do was speak. I didn't mean to make you look bad. I was just scared. Duplicate Morgan would be ashamed of me if she were here. I was making her look like a coward. Holly stared at me dispassionately. Please, I said, desperate to avoid her wrath. Please don't torture me. A smile curved her mouth. Oh, don't worry, Morgan. I have no intention of torturing you. Relief cascaded over me in waves, and I closed my eyes in sweet relief. No, she said, I have something else in mind. I opened my eyes to see what she could possibly do to me that was worse than torture. Secretary Hart and I discussed it, she said. We decided it would be much more effective if we used our persuasive methods on Amy instead. No, I screamed. You can't do that. My gaze ricocheted wildly around the room, desperate for help of some kind, but everyone ignored me. A knock sounded at the door. Hart glanced at Robertson, who walked to the door and opened it. A woman in a lab coat walked in. My mind screamed a warning. She's here for Amy. She's going to put something in her neck, just like they did to DM. Robertson and the woman walked directly to Amy, who thrashed around ineffectively in her chair. Only her head and shoulders moved, but she fought with all she had. Amy, I yelled as loud as I could, frantic to take attention away from my little sister. Leave her alone. She didn't do anything. No one even looked at me as Robertson placed his hands on either side of Amy's head, holding her still. The woman rubbed something against the base of Amy's skull, then paused, evidently waiting for something to begin working. After a moment, the woman lifted a small needle from a bag she'd set on the floor, then bent forward and punctured the skin on Amy's neck. Amy made a sound through the duct tape affixed to her mouth, but Robertson held her immobilized. Hatred for these people poured through me, and I knew if it were me being tortured, I would resist with all I had. But it's not you, I thought. It's Amy, my little sister. My eyes went to Hart. I had to do whatever I could to stop him, although it didn't seem like there was much I could do. Not while I was bound to a chair surrounded by people who would do anything to stop Nick and his group. What about Mills, I thought. Maybe he'll help Amy. Then I remembered Mills' suggestion that Nick give Amy to Holly as a sacrifice. I closed my eyes, all hope fleeing. The door clicked, and I knew the woman with the lab coat must have left, but I didn't want to open my eyes. I didn't want to face what would inevitably come next. Ah, there you are, Hart said. Then a familiar voice spoke. Father? My eyes flew open, and I stared into the crystal blue eyes of Falcon. Chapter 48. Falcon. His name came out on a breath. Then I spoke louder. Falcon, they're going to torture Hummingbird. You have to do something. He looked at me impassively, then he turned to Hart. He's not going to help anyone, Morgan, Hart said. Then he laughed. Well, he has helped me. He smiled at Falcon. He told me everything. What? Confused, my eyes went from Hart to Falcon and back to Hart. Why would Falcon help his father? He hated his father. Had he been just pretending all this time? It had seemed so genuine. Wanting to deny Hart's words, I shook my head. No, he wouldn't do that. Maybe not at first, Hart said, but as you'll find out for yourself, I can be very persuasive. He hadn't done it willingly. Knowing that brought me great comfort and just a little hope. What did he tell you? What did you do to him? Hart laughed. I'm not going to tell you everything he told me because I want to see if you corroborate his story, but I will tell you one thing. I know Nick is aware that we've developed a method to, shall we say, induce people to behave the way we'd like them to. You mean by drugging people? My anger had gotten the best of me. I clamped my mouth shut, not wanting to say more than I should. Hart gazed at me. You drugged Falcon, I said, the truth of it dawning on me. That's how you got him to talk. That's why you let him walk in here on his own. I looked at Falcon, but he stared right past me like I wasn't even there. We found that some people need additional convincing, Hart said. So we injected some of the drug directly into Jacob's system. He smiled. It worked remarkably well. Any hope that Falcon would help me or Amy evaporated. My world began to collapse around me, despair and hopelessness filling the empty spaces. "Let's get started," Hart said, as he sat beside Holly, who had set a small rectangular device on the table in front of her. "I considered hooking you up to a polygraph machine, Morgan, but with Jacob here to tell me if you're lying or not, that's no longer necessary." Worried about what Falcon had told his father, my mind raced with what to say. "Stand beside me, son," Hart said, as he motioned for Falcon to approach. "In your rightful place." Without a word, or a glance at Amy or me, Falcon walked around the table to stand between his father and Holly. "Morgan, tell me the name of the man you and Falcon saw meeting with Nick." Hart's lip curled. "The man who betrayed me." "Seth Robertson," I thought. The name flashed into my mind, but I hesitated. Seth Robertson stood somewhere behind me, near Mills. I feared what would happen when I spoke his name. Had Falcon already told his father Robertson's name? It was like I was on some sort of game show, where if my answer matched my partner's, I would win a prize. Only this game was the opposite. If my answer didn't match my partner's, something bad would happen, like Amy being jolted by the torture device. I shifted my gaze to Amy, who watched me with eyes shimmering with tears. She didn't shake her head to tell me it was okay, or nod to tell me to go ahead. She didn't give me any indication of what I should do. Her fate was in my hands. I hated this. "Morgan?" Hart prompted. My gaze jerked back to him. "The name." "Seth," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Seth Robertson." "I can't hear you," Hart said, his eyes hard. "Seth Robertson," I said again, this time in a loud and steady voice. "What the—" The voice came from behind me, which told me at least one thing. If Falcon had told Hart Robertson's name, Hart hadn't revealed it to Robertson. "Very good," Hart said. Then he smiled. "But there's more to it, isn't there, Morgan?" More to it? What was he looking for? Had Falcon also told him that the name was a lie? My eyes went to Falcon, and for a split second it almost seemed like he was still in there. "Morgan?" My attention shifted to Hart. Desperate to say the right thing, I struggled with what to say. "I don't understand." He sighed. "There's more to it than what you're telling me, isn't there?" I don't know what you mean." "Holly?" Hart said, glancing at the woman sitting near him. "Wait!" I screamed. Holly's finger descended toward the device in front of her, but when Hart held up his hand, she stopped. My heart pummeled my ribs. Holly had been about to press the button that would hurt Amy, just like it had hurt duplicate Morgan. "What is it, Morgan?" Hart asked, his voice completely calm. I closed my eyes, then forced myself to look at Hart. "It's a lie," I said in a quiet voice. Touching the top of his ear, like he couldn't hear me, Hart asked, "What's that?" "The name. It's a lie." "Explain." "No one came to see Nick. Not Seth Robertson. Not anyone else." Hart leaned back in his chair as a smile curved his mouth. "So far so good, Morgan. Your story matches Jacob's." Relieved, yet upset, I again wondered how much Falcon had told him. "Why did Nick want you to tell me that lie?" he asked. The answer didn't divulge any great secrets, so I decided to tell him the truth. "He was using it as a way to get you to agree to release Amy." Hart nodded. "Trade information for her release?" "Yes." "When did you betray me, Morgan?" "I didn't want to, but Nick's people figured out that Falcon knew you." "Uh-huh." "Why are you spilling your guts so easily?" I thought. "Coward!" "When?" I stared at my lap as shame swept over me. Shame for not being as strong as DM. "The day after we got there." "You're pathetic," Hart sneered. I agreed, but I didn't respond. Instead, I kept my gaze locked onto my lap. "In your first note," Hart said, "you wrote that Nick had implied that something big was on the horizon. I know he knows about our methods to help people make better choices. What else does he know? What does he think is on the horizon?" The euphemism for using drugs to control people wasn't lost on me. But had Falcon told his father that Nick had proof that the government was going to release the drug-laced power bars to the public? If he hadn't, I didn't want to be the one to tell him. What if Hart stopped Nick from warning people? I had to be believable when I lied, so I lifted my eyes to look at Hart. He never told me what he knew. I guess after finding out that I was supposed to gather information for you, he didn't trust me. Hart laughed. I wouldn't trust you either. Did that mean he believed me? In fact, he said, I don't trust you now. Uh-oh. I think you're lying to me. He thinks I'm lying? Did that mean he wasn't sure? Maybe Falcon hadn't told him about Nick's proof. I'm not, I said, as I locked my eyes with his. Just to make sure, let's give Amy a little jolt and see if that changes your story. No, I said, as panic grew within me. Please don't hurt her. I'm telling you the truth. We'll know soon enough. He turned to Holly. Give me the device. She handed it to him, a questioning look on her face. Hart held the device in his hand, then he smiled at me. To show you who's in charge here, I'm going to have Jacob do it. What? You don't seem to understand that we're playing by my rules. However, Jacob understands that now. I want you to understand it too. I do know that, I said, frantic to stop him. I understand you're in charge, Secretary Hart. I do. He shook his head. I don't think you truly understand, Morgan. If you did, you would answer my questions fully and completely without me needing to ask over and over. I will. The pitch of my voice rose. I'll answer them, I swear. His eyes hardened. I know you will. Then he held the device out to Jacob, who stood beside him. Son, hold this in your hand, and when I tell you to, press it right here. Falcon took the device from his father. Yes, sir. My eyes went to Falcon, who stared at the device in his hand. Was he in there, even a little bit, or was he lost to me? Falcon! Falcon, look at me! But he didn't. It was like he couldn't hear me. Falcon, please! My voice broke as a sob tore from my throat. Now, son, Hart said. Press it now. Chapter 49. All eyes were on Falcon as he stared at the device in his hand. Slowly, he lifted his free hand until it rose above the device. Then he extended a finger. No, Falcon, I screamed. Stop! You have to stop! His finger descended inexorably toward the device. I turned to look at Amy. Tears streamed down her face. Amy, I moaned. I'm so sorry. As much as I thought DM had messed things up, I'd only made them worse. Come on, Jacob, Hart said. His voice drew my attention back to Falcon, who seemed to be hesitating. Falcon, I yelled. Falcon, don't do it! With my gaze riveted to Falcon, I saw his eyes flick to a spot behind me. Evidently Hart noticed it too. What are you doing, son? Press the button. It's time. Then, without any warning whatsoever, Falcon threw the device. It sailed over my head, and I heard the smack of someone catching it. Hart leapt to his feet. Mills, bring that to me. Falcon had thrown it to Mills. Hope blossomed inside me. I craned my neck to see what was happening behind me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mills drop the device to the floor, then stomp on it 3 times. Mills was going to help us. What are you doing? Hart shouted, his eyes wide with rage. A fist swung toward Mills, then Robertson came into view, and the 2 men began throwing punches. A crash sounded in front of me. I whipped my head around to see Hart on the ground, with Falcon on top of him. Holly looked stunned as she sat in her chair. The sound of scuffling continued behind me. Falcon, I whispered as my face lit with a smile. You're okay. He must have been faking it, at least for the last few minutes. The sound of his punches landing on his father made me cringe, then sudden movement caught my eye. Holly jumped out of her chair and raced from the room. Falcon, I yelled. Holly left. She'll bring help. In his fury, Falcon didn't seem to hear me. Falcon, I screamed. We need to leave, now. More enforcers will be coming any second. That got his attention. He He stopped punching his father, who was unconscious, and hurried over to me. "Raven, are you okay?" "Yes, but Holly left. We need to get out of here." I glanced toward Mills and saw him land a final punch on Robertson, who appeared to be unconscious. Falcon looked at the cuffs on my ankles and wrists. "I don't have a key." "I do," Mills said, as he knelt beside me. Blood spattered his face, but he seemed all right. Then I was free. "Thank you," I said. "Thank you for helping us." Something between a smile and a frown crossed his features. "Nick's orders." Falcon took the key from Mills and went to Amy. "Nick knows we're here?" I asked. Mills nodded. "The moment you were captured, I told him." "How did you know I'd been captured?" "It was broadcast over our internal system." "Let's go," Falcon said. When Amy stood in front of me, I leapt from my chair and yanked her into my arms. "Are you okay?" "I was so scared," she said through fresh tears. Then she pulled away and touched the back of her neck. "It's still in me. I want it out." Frantically clawing at her neck, her voice became hysterical. "Get it out, Morgan! Get it out now!" There was nothing I could do about it. "We have to get to Nick. He'll take it out." "Come on," Mills said. "I'll show you the way." I looked at Robertson and wondered how long he and Hart would be unconscious. Mills led us out of the room and down a hall, but just as we turned a corner, I heard shouts and footsteps somewhere behind us. Holly had brought reinforcements. "In here," Mills said as he opened a door to a supply closet. The four of us huddled together as footsteps thundered down the hall just outside the door. When silence enveloped us, no one dared move for several minutes. Mills cracked the door open and peered into the hall, then he turned to us. "Time to go." To my surprise, he led us back the way we'd come. "Where are you taking us?" "They'll be heading to the exits, so that's where we don't want to be." It made sense, although it felt wrong to be going deeper into Camp Stonewater. "Did you tell your father about Nick's plan to release proof about the power bars?" I whispered to Falcon as we followed Mills up 2 flights of stairs. "No." I wanted to ask him more questions, but Mills had stopped on the landing. He opened the door and looked both ways, then motioned for us to follow him. We stepped into the hallway. No one seemed to be around, and I wondered if everyone had been put on lockdown. Everyone except the enforcers. Mills led us down the hallway and into an empty classroom. "Now what?" Falcon asked. Mills went to the teacher's desk and opened a drawer, then held up a rope. "We climb out." "Where'd that come from?" Falcon asked. "I stashed it here earlier when I knew you and Morgan had been captured. Nick gave me orders to rescue all 3 of you, so I had to come up with a plan." I was glad someone had a plan. I went to a window and stared at the glass, then turned to Mills. "It doesn't look like it can open." "Of course not, which is why I also stashed a glass cutter." "Nice," Falcon said with a smile. Mills sank an eye-bolt into a wall stud below the window, then he cut a large opening into the glass and set the cut-out piece on the floor. Next, he anchored the rope to the eye-bolt, then leaned out the window and dropped the rope. "Falcon, you go first." With a brief nod, Falcon sat on the edge of the window, then gripped the rope and began his descent. Mills watched until Falcon had reached the ground, then he turned to Amy. "You're next." Amy went to the window and looked down. Then she looked at me with undisguised fear. "It's 3 stories." "You can do it," I said. I only hoped I would have the courage myself. She shook her head. "No." Mills sighed, then looked at me. "You go." There was no way I would leave Amy behind. If I went first, would Mills make her go next, or would he leave her? I strode to Amy, put my hands on her shoulders, and stared at her. "You have to go, now. If you don't, you may never get out of here." I raised my eyebrows. "Now, go." She bit her lip, then whispered, "Okay." She sat on the windowsill, gripped the rope in her hands, then swung herself around so that she could climb down. She disappeared from view. I stuck my head out the window and watched her slow descent, then looked to the left and to the right to see if anyone was coming. When Amy reached the ground, I sighed in relief. "Your turn," Mills said, "and hurry." I didn't give myself time to worry about falling 3 floors to the ground, instead moving forward on instinct, sit on the sill, grab the rope, turn my body around, and used the building to steady myself as I climbed down, hand over hand. Not permitting myself to look down, I focused on not slipping, and before I knew it, hands were steadying my waist. "You made it, Raven," Falcon said into my ear. Sweet relief poured over me, and I turned to him with a wide grin. I looked up and saw Mills descending rapidly, and then he was down. "Now what?" I asked him. "Wait here." He ran to the end of the building, but when he peered around the corner, he pressed himself against the wall. "Someone must be coming," I said. All of our attention was riveted to Mills and what was happening at that end of the building. Amy cried out. I turned to see what was wrong just as she collapsed to the ground. "Amy," I said as I knelt beside her. "Amy, what's wrong?" Her eyes were closed and she wasn't moving. "Amy!" I looked up at Falcon for help, but he wasn't looking at me or Amy. I followed his line of vision, then gasped. Holly stood a few feet away, a new, fully intact torture device in her hand. Chapter 50. Ignoring Holly, I turned back to Amy, but she was out cold. "Amy, wake up! You have to wake up!" I shook her, but she didn't respond. I leapt to my feet and glared at Holly. "Why?" I screamed. Any fear I'd felt for her fled as raw hatred took over, and I rushed her. Clearly startled, she stiffened, but I didn't slow down, plowing right into her and knocking her to the ground. The torture device went flying, but I ignored it as my hands circled her neck. Squeezing with all my might, I felt her hands pulling on my forearms, but I paid no attention, only wanting to punish her for hurting Amy. Without warning, I was yanked off of her. "No, Raven," Falcon said. "You'll just make things worse." Furious at him for stopping me, I turned on him. "She hurt Amy, for no reason!" Which reminded me of the torture device. I spun around and saw it on the ground, then dove for it before Holly could recover and pick it up. I shoved it in my pocket, then stared at Falcon. "Make sure she doesn't move." Then I dashed back to Amy, who had finally woken up. "What happened?" she asked, clearly shaken as she lay on the grass. Not wanting to hide the truth from her, I said, "It was Holly." Her eyes widened and she began to hyperventilate. She sat up and looked around, her expression frantic. "We have to get out of here." "I know." My gaze shot to Mills, who hurried toward us, obviously worried. "What's wrong?" "Too many enforcers that way. We need to move." "Can you get up?" I asked Amy. Mills didn't wait for her to answer, scooping her up and tossing her over his shoulder. Then he began running in the opposite direction from where he'd been stationed. "Hey!" Amy said, but she didn't fight him. I glanced at Holly as Falcon and I followed Mills past her. Fury radiated from her eyes, but she didn't make a move to get up and follow us. Racing to the end of the building, I didn't let myself consider what would happen if the enforcers caught up with us, instead focusing on keeping up with Mills and Falcon. But the moment we rounded the corner, I knew we were in trouble. Secretary Hart stood in front of a pair of enforcers, his face showing clear signs of Falcon's beating. We stopped dead in our tracks. Mills was in front, with Falcon and me right behind him. Mills set Amy on the ground, and she hurried over to me. "Are you okay, Hummingbird?" Falcon murmured. She nodded. "The flock of 3, Hart boomed, "and 1 traitor." As if by instinct, I grabbed Amy by the hand, spun on my heel, and ran. She managed to keep up with me, and when I glanced behind me, I saw Falcon and Mills gaining on us. "Faster, Raven," Falcon said. I didn't need any urging from him to run as fast as I could, but Amy had been weakened by Holly's use of the torture device, and she was having trouble keeping up. "Where is she?" Amy panted. "What?" "Holly, where is she?" That's when I noticed that Holly was nowhere in sight. "I don't know." With Hart and his enforcers behind us, I couldn't allow myself to worry about Holly just then. Maybe she went back in the building. "To get more enforcers?" Amy asked. Not wanting to panic her or myself, I didn't reply. A gunshot rang out. I yanked Amy to the ground, and Falcon threw himself on top of us. "Don't move," Hart said, his voice dripping with contempt. The weight of Falcon disappeared from my body, and I heard him grunt. I lifted my head and saw Falcon pinned to the ground by one of Hart's enforcers. Mills was lying on the ground beside me, holding unnaturally still. A red stain blossomed on his shirt. He'd been shot. "Mills," I said as I reached for him. "I said don't move," Hart said. Then he pressed his boot onto my back. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Hart pointing his gun right at me. Then I remembered how he'd casually told Falcon that I could die in an accident. Pure terror pulsed through me, and tears filled my eyes. "I don't want to die," I thought. "Please, please don't kill me." Hart removed his boot from my back. "Get up, slowly." I did as he commanded, my body trembling. "Now you," he said to Amy. She pushed herself up and pressed against me. I wrapped an arm around her. Hart gripped my other arm with his left hand, then used his right to press the gun into my back. "Move!" Fear cascaded over me, making my legs weak. I forced them to take one step forward, then another, then another. I glanced over my shoulder. Falcon was being led by one of the enforcers. The other knelt next to Mills and spoke into some sort of device. I hoped he was getting help for him. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Back inside to finish our conversation." Dread crashed over me. Would this nightmare never end? There was no way Hart would let me go. Not now. Not after we tried to escape. Hart led us around the front of the building and into the lobby where Holly was coming out of a door followed by another pair of enforcers. She strode right up to me, ignoring Hart. "You're going to pay for what you did." Then she snatched the torture device out of my back pocket. "What's going on, Holly?" Hart asked. Holly turned to him. Her eyes narrowed. "She tried to kill me." He frowned. "Calm down." "I'm not going to calm down. The little witch nearly strangled me to death." "I know you're upset, but you'll have plenty of time to exact your revenge." Exact her revenge, I thought. The idea sent tremors of fear shooting through me. Holly's nostrils flared as she stood right in front of me, her eyes boring into mine. "No, I'm not going to wait." My eyes widened as she stepped closer. "Leave me alone," I squeaked out. "You've been nothing but trouble from the moment I laid eyes on you," she sneered. "First, refusing to cooperate, then humiliating me by escaping at the high school. And today—" She shook her head, her eyes never leaving mine. "Today was the last straw." She touched her throat. "I'm going to have a ring of bruises on my neck, all because of you." She jabbed a finger into my chest, making me fall back a step. Hart kept his grip on my arm, but he didn't try to stop her. "Leave her alone," Amy said, her voice shaking. Holly glared at her. "You're just like her, aren't you?" Her jaw tightened. "It's a good thing we're locking you up now, before you can cause me trouble." "I want to be like her," Amy said with defiance in her eyes. "Just like her." Pride in my sister burst within me. Even in the face of danger, she was courageous. She deserved my admiration much more than I deserved hers. "Don't be stupid," Holly said, her voice dripping with disdain. Then she turned her attention back to me. "Why don't you do something right for a change and help your sister understand why it's important to follow the rules?" Knowing no one would believe me, I said, "I haven't done anything wrong." Holly's eyebrows pulled together in an angry scowl. "You're not serious, Morgan." "That's enough," Hart said in a bored voice. "I don't have time to listen to the two of you arguing. I need to get information." "I don't know anything," I said in a desperate attempt to get them to let us go. "We'll find out soon enough," Hart said. Then he jerked me forward. "Secretary Hart," a female voice called out. We turned to see Jessica Walker, the reporter who'd interviewed me, standing in the doorway of the lobby with her cameraman behind her. Chapter 51. Hart quickly put the gun away. "What do you want?" Jessica held the door open for her cameraman, and he stepped into the lobby, his camera recording. "I just received exclusive information that I find very disturbing, and I would like to get your response." Hart seemed to hesitate. Had Nick released his proof? "What is it?" Hart finally asked. "What's your big scoop?" She strode up to us and looked right at Hart. Then she paused as she evidently noticed the wounds on his face. "What happened to you?" He shook his head. "A minor car accident. Now what do you want?" Jessica tilted her head slightly, as if she wasn't sure if he was telling the truth. Then she said, "I've been informed that the power bars you serve at the federally assisted thinning centers are addictive, and that there's something in them that attempts to control behavior. What do you have to say about that?" She held the microphone up to him. "That allegation is completely false." "My sources tell me otherwise. In fact, along with the allegation came documentation that supports the claim." Hart's grip tightened on my arm. "What kind of documentation?" "Several items, actually." Jessica smiled. "For example, email exchanges discussing the effects of the drugs in the power bars, as well as results of animal trials." She seemed to hesitate, then she glanced at me. "There are even some video clips of people being affected by the power bars, withdrawals, for example, after being denied the power bars." She glanced at me again. "And a video of Morgan Campbell appearing intoxicated after eating several power bars." No, I thought, not me. Duplicate Morgan. "Where did you get this?" Hart asked, obviously infuriated. "Who gave it to you?" It was Nick, I thought. He'd given it to her. I held back a smile. "So," Jessica said, "you don't deny the existence of this documentation?" I turned to Hart. His face flushed, his lips flattened, and his eyes bulged. "You should know," Jessica said in a smooth voice, "you're on live television right now." Hart stood stock still. "I have one other item, sir," she said. "I've also learned that these same power bars are going to be sold to the general public within a month." She paused. "I've seen the ad campaigns, which, from all appearances, are ready to roll out." She held the mic up to Hart. "Any comments, sir?" He shoved the mic away. "No comments." Jessica didn't move. "You're trespassing," Hart said. "This is government property," she said with a smile. Then she gestured to the space in which we stood. "And this is the lobby, open to the public." Hart's jaw clenched. Then he began to turn away with me still in his grasp. "Wait!" I cried out. He stopped. I turned so that Amy and I faced the camera. "Help us, please," I said to the camera with pleading in my eyes. "They've put something in Amy's neck." I spun Amy around and lifted her hair to show the spot where the woman in the lab coat had inserted the device. The cameraman zoomed in. "That woman," I pointed to Holly, "she has something that she used to hurt Amy." Tears filled my eyes as I stared into the camera. "Amy is only 13, and the pain from the device made her pass out. She was unconscious." A sob tore from my throat. "Please, please, somebody help us." "That's enough," Hart said. Then he yanked my arm. I pointed to Hart. "He shot an enforcer a few minutes ago. He's probably dead by now." "This girl," Hart spat out, "killed one of our enforcers." "No," I shouted. "I didn't. I haven't done anything. I swear." "You should know," Jessica said to the camera as she turned her back to us, "that the information we're giving you, that you are about to be sold drug-laced power bars, that information was only gathered thanks to this girl." She pointed to me. "If it wasn't for her, you—" She paused for dramatic effect. "And your children," she shook her head, "your children would be drugged as well. And now the head of the enforcement department wants to silence her." "Shut her up," Hart murmured to one of the enforcers. "Now." "Okay," the enforcer said to Jessica as he shoved the camera downward. "That's enough." Hart pulled on my arm, and I couldn't stop my forward movement. "Help us!" I screamed. "Someone please help us!" Despite my pleading, He and his men dragged me, Amy, and Falcon through a door, which they locked behind us. No one could help us now. Chapter 52. "Nice try, Morgan," Holly said with a frown, as we entered the interrogation room from which we'd escaped such a short time before. "But no one cares about you or your sister or your pathetic attempt to get help." I knew what she said was true, yet I couldn't allow myself to fully accept it. Doing that would mean giving up all hope. I wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. Maybe someone will care. Maybe my cries for help wouldn't fall on deaf ears. Nick had released his proof. Maybe it would make a difference, especially if people realized that they could be affected. I clung to the idea that the public would care enough about themselves to do something. Anything. The enforcers cuffed all three of us to the chairs, then put duct tape over both Amy and Falcon's mouths. Then, the woman in the lab coat entered the room. Worried about why she was there, I watched her every move, and when she walked straight toward me and stopped in front of me, I stiffened. "Hold her still," the woman said to someone behind me. A large pair of hands pressed against the sides of my head like a vice. "No!" I screamed. "No! No! No!" "Quiet," Holly said with a cruel smile. "You've done this before." "No, I haven't," I wanted to cry out. "That was another girl." Now I would know exactly how DM had felt. My worst nightmare had become my reality. Something wet swiped across the base of my skull. Then I felt pressure as the woman inserted the device. The vice grip around my head vanished. "It's in me," I thought. "It's in me, and I can't get it out." I wanted to claw at my neck, but my hands were bound to the arms of the chair. My heart pounded against my ribs, and I thought I might actually have a heart attack. Holly glanced at Hart. "I'd like to make sure it's working." Hart leaned back in his chair and flicked his hand like he was dismissing a bothersome fly. "Whatever, just make it quick." "Please," I sobbed. "Don't do it, please." Holly stared at me, her eyes cold. Then she turned her attention to the device in her hand. I wished Falcon hadn't stopped me from strangling her to death. The thought shocked me, but at that moment, that was how I felt. As Holly's finger descended toward the device, her gaze ricocheted between my face and the device, a wicked grin lighting her eyes. She wanted to watch the fear play out on my face. Mesmerized by the agonizingly slow descent of her finger, I was almost relieved when her finger finally touched the screen. A blast of excruciating pain jolted through my skull and ripped down my spine, making my body go rigid and my thoughts go blank. All I could do was endure, and after several long seconds that seemed to last a lifetime, the pain stopped. "Yes," Holly said calmly, "it appears to be working." Tears cascaded down my face, and I knew I would tell them anything they wanted to know. Anything. "Very good," Hart said as he straightened in his chair. "Let's get this wrapped up. I have other things to take care of." He met my eyes, but I had trouble seeing him through the curtain of tears. "Morgan, is Nick responsible for the evidence that reporter talked about?" I didn't even hesitate. "Yes." A triumphant smile lifted the corners of his mouth. Whether from the fact that he'd broken me so easily, or because he'd guessed correctly about Nick, I didn't know, and I didn't care. I just wanted this interrogation to end. At least they weren't threatening Amy any longer. "What does Nick know?" I glanced at Falcon, ashamed for him to see me spill my guts so easily, but he nodded like he was telling me it was okay. I hadn't expected his approval, but it helped tremendously. I shifted my focus to Amy, and she nodded too. Tears of relief filled my eyes, and I tried to wipe my wet cheeks against my shoulders. "Morgan?" I was taking too long. Afraid Holly would happily jolt me again, I began speaking. "He just said he had proof that the power bars had drugs in them, and that you were going to start selling them to the public." "How did he get that proof?" "I guess he broke into your building on that day I was doing the interview." I bit my lip. "He was using the interview as a distraction." Anger swept over Hart's face, and he spoke through clenched teeth. "What else?" "We were trying to get Amy back before he released the proof." Hart's face seemed to relax. "I guess he didn't want to wait any longer, which shows how little he really cares about you." Was that true? Had he given up on us? My shoulders slumped as the truth of Hart's words sank to the very heart of me. Nick had known he couldn't help us, so he'd moved forward with his plan. No one was going to help us now. Why would they? No one cared about us anymore. Despair threatened to overwhelm me. I stared at my lap. That's all I know. Hart sighed, then he stood, drawing my attention. He looked at Holly. "Put them in separate rooms." "Yes, sir." With one final glance at the three of us, Hart left the room. Chapter 53. There were 3 enforcers in the interrogation room, one for each of us. They unshackled us from the chairs, but immediately cuffed our arms behind our backs. Falcon tried mightily to get out of the grasp of the enforcer who held on to him, but I didn't fight at all. I'd given up. Resigned to my fate, I let an enforcer lead me down the hall and into an elevator. Amy, Falcon, and 2 more enforcers joined us, and before long we arrived on the 5th floor. The enforcers began moving Amy and me off of the elevator, but not Falcon. I barely had a chance to glance at him before the elevator doors slid closed. Hart had said to put us all in separate rooms, but I wondered if there was a way to have Amy stay with me. We stopped in front of a door where an enforcer waved his card in front of a reader before opening the door and shoving me in. "Wait," I said. He stared at me with annoyance. I gestured to Amy. "Can she be in here too?" "No." He closed the door before I could say another word, including telling Amy goodbye. I faced the room and saw 2 beds and 2 dressers, as well as a bathroom. Had DM been in a room like this? Maybe she'd been in this room. The thought gave me a feeling of kinship with the girl who'd suffered more than I had, and I'd suffered a lot lately. I went to the barred window and stared outside. I couldn't see much, and figured Hart wouldn't want me in a room where I could actually see anything interesting. He wanted me to suffer. It was working. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, waiting to see what would happen next. I didn't have to wait long. Half an hour later, my door opened. I quickly sat up in preparation for whatever assault might be coming, but there was no assault. In fact, it was a girl about my age carrying a tray of food. An enforcer stood in the doorway, to prevent me from escaping, I assumed. The girl didn't acknowledge me as she set the tray on top of the dresser. Desperate to speak to someone who didn't hate me, I asked, "What's your name?" Her eyes widened as she concentrated on her task, but she didn't look my way, and the moment she had delivered the food, she hurried from the room. The door closed, and the lock clicked into place. I hadn't eaten in hours, and I was famished. There were no power bars. I assumed that was because Hart knew I would never eat them, so why waste them on me? I ate the food, then lay on the bed. Trying not to feel sorry for myself, I turned my thoughts to Amy and Falcon and wondered if their rooms looked identical to mine. Were they as scared as I was? Had someone brought them something to eat? The afternoon dragged on with no more visitors, and eventually night came. Uncertain about my fate, I slept fitfully. My dreams turned to nightmares. Then I woke up and was devastated all over again that my nightmares had become my reality. When morning finally came, I dreaded what lay ahead of me. Would Hart have more questions for me? Would Holly have the chance to torture me some more? The unknown was almost worse than facing my fears. When the girl brought me breakfast, I stared at her, hoping she would look at me, but she didn't. After days of this, I expected to be ignored, so when she glanced at me with a smile as she delivered my breakfast 3 days later, I didn't know what to make of it. Was she going to be friendly now? Would I manage to find one person who didn't hate me? The possibility brought a tiny bit of light to my otherwise depressing existence. With nothing to look forward to, I took my time eating my meal, then did some stretches. A knock on the door startled me. No one had come to see me since I'd been put in the room. I was instantly on high alert. The knock sounded again. Who would knock on the door? Didn't they know I had no way to let them in? Fear and uncertainty made me want to hide, but I forced myself to stand in place and face whatever was coming. Was it Hart? Or maybe Holly? But why would either of them knock? They had the key. They were the ones who had put me here in the first place. When I heard the click of the door unlocking, my heart raced with trepidation. Then the door flew open and Amy burst into the room. "Morgan," she said with a bright smile. "Amy?" I whispered, confused. Then my eyes went to the open door, where I saw Falcon stationed with an enforcer right behind him. Why were they there? Were they going to take me to Holly? But Amy wouldn't do that, unless Hart had drugged Falcon again and he was making her. Amy rushed toward me, then she threw her arms around me. Not understanding how my sister could be in my room and looking so happy, I froze. She pulled away and smiled. "I'm so glad to see you, Morgan. Are you okay?" I met her eyes and slowly nodded. Falcon walked over to us, and when he stopped beside me, I scrutinized his face. His eyes looked clear, not drug-hazed. "What's going on?" I finally asked as my gaze went from Falcon's face to Amy's. "Why are you here? How are you here?" My eyes narrowed. "Why would Hart let you come in here?" Amy looked at Falcon, whose face reddened. "My father," he began, "has been arrested." Chapter 54. Arrested? Shocked by this news, I sank onto the bed. Amy sat beside me, and Falcon sat across from us on the other bed. "Yeah," he said. "When everyone heard his plan to release the drug-laced power bars to the public, they were pretty upset. They demanded his arrest." "But that's not all," Amy said, her eyes dancing with delight. I turned to her expectantly. "Jessica Walker interviewed Nick, and he said the only reason he'd found out about the power bars was because of you." "Me?" That wasn't true. Duplicate Morgan was the one who discovered the power bars had drugs in them. But that means me, I reminded myself, so yeah, it was true. "Oh." "Yeah," Falcon said. "So, in addition to demanding my father's arrest, they're also demanding that the authorities let you go." "Let me go?" I'd been locked in my room for days, and now I was desperately playing catch-up. "Yes, Morgan," a male voice said. My attention shifted to the doorway. Nick stood there with no enforcers in sight. Still not clear on what was going on, I stood and walked toward him, uncertain how he felt about me. After all, he'd released the proof about the power bars while Amy, Falcon, and I were in the hands of Hart. "How are you, Morgan?" he asked with a warm smile. "I'm okay." "You must be wondering what's going on." "You could say that." "Let's talk," he said as he led me back to my spot beside Amy. Then he sat next to Falcon. "You know about Russell Hart being arrested?" I glanced at Falcon, wondering how he felt about that. Then I looked at Nick and nodded. "And I'm going to be let go?" "That's right. Once the public learned about the power bars, it was the tipping point we'd hoped for." A look of satisfaction came over him. "It changed everything, Morgan." "Everything? What do you mean?" "I mean, not only are they demanding your release, but many people are demanding that the fat centers be closed down." He paused. "All those videos you did, they had a powerful impact on people." "Really?" Amazed to know that the videos I'd made had caused such a dramatic result, I shook my head in wonder. "That's great." "It's all thanks to you." "Me?" Uncomfortable with getting credit for what DM had done, I wanted to protest. "These last few weeks, you've kept the focus on what is wrong with our system, and you made it clear that things need to change." Nick tilted his head downward while keeping his gaze locked on mine. "You, Morgan. That was you." Me, I thought. Not DM, but me? The idea had never occurred to me, but now I realized it was true. Maybe I really had made a difference. "There's a new secretary of the enforcement department," Nick said. "His name is Victor Marsh." "Do you know him?" "No. He's not from the enforcement department." Nick smiled. "But that's probably a good thing. I expect he'll be a breath of fresh air, which is just what the department needs." Nick paused. "He'll be holding a press conference in a couple of hours to announce your pardon." "I'm being pardoned?" That was better than just being let go. "What about Hansen's death?" They've ruled it an accident, so you're completely clear." As the good news sunk in, elation swept over me, and I turned to Amy with a smile. "We're going home." She nodded. Then I remembered Josh Mills being shot and Scott being captured. I asked Nick about them. "Mills is in the hospital and is expected to make a full recovery. Scott's been released. He'll be fine." Even though I'd been angry with Mills for suggesting that Nick turn Amy over to Holly, as far as I was concerned, he had redeemed himself when he tried to help us escape. I was glad to know he would be okay. I thought about the woman who had clearly enjoyed torturing both me and Amy. What about Holly? "She's in jail too," Falcon said, his voice hard. "Exactly where she deserves to be." I was glad to know she wouldn't be able to hurt me or anyone else. Then my hand went to my neck. "I want this out." "As soon as we're done talking," Nick said, "I'll turn you over to the people who can safely take it out." "I'm really going home today?" "That's right, Morgan." I sagged with relief and joy. I would be home that day, with my family. No more running, no more hiding. "Your parents are waiting to take you home, right after the press conference." He smiled. "But you can see them as soon as you want." I glanced around the room where I'd spent the last few days. "I don't want them to come in here, to see where I've been." "That's fine. You can see them after the transmitter is removed. I'll arrange a private meeting before the press conference." He paused. "You should know that there are a lot of people outside waiting to see you, and they're going to want to hear from you." "From me?" It kind of shocked me that people would take notice of me, let alone come to Camp Stonewater to see me. "Yes, so you should think about what you want to say." "All right." Nick stood. "Are you ready to get started?" Fear had been my constant companion for the last few weeks, and now I was about to be set free. It felt surreal. If Amy, Falcon, and Nick hadn't been sitting beside me telling me the incredible news, I wasn't sure I would have believed it. "Yes," I said as I stood. "I am definitely ready to get started." "I'll see you when you're done, Raven," Falcon said, his crystal blue eyes sparkling. "Me too," Amy added. I nodded, then followed Nick from the room. Chapter 55. My neck felt tender as I followed Nick from the room where someone had removed the torture device. But it was a good tenderness, the kind that let me know a problem had been resolved. "Your family's waiting for you in a private room," he said. "What about Falcon?" Now that his father was in jail, I was worried about him. It had sounded like his brother's opinion about the way society should be run aligned with their father. Would he let Falcon continue living with him? "He's there as well." "Good." We stopped outside a closed door. "I'll come for you when it's time for the press conference to begin." "Thank you." He appraised me. "No, thank you, Morgan. I know you've doubted yourself and compared yourself to the Morgan from the other world, but I hope you can see the difference that you've made." I was beginning to, but I appreciated his confidence in me. I smiled, then opened the door. 6 pairs of eyes turned in my direction. Then Mom and Dad jumped up from their seats and rushed to me, their arms open. I flung myself into their embrace. "Oh, sweetheart," Mom said, her voice shaking. "It's so wonderful to see you." "Mom, Dad." Tears clogged my throat as I reveled in the warmth of their love. "I love you so much," Dad said. "I'm so glad you're safe." "I love you too." I pulled away and smiled at him, my eyes wet with tears. "We can go home today." "We know," Dad said. "We're so thrilled." "Morgan," Zach and Brandon said as they wrapped their arms around me. I pulled them against me, never so happy to see them as I was at that moment. I met Amy's eyes, then Falcon's, and smiled, my heart so full I thought it would burst. The 7 of us chatted while we waited for Nick to come and get me, which helped to calm my nerves. An hour later, a knock sounded at the door, then it opened. But it wasn't Nick. It was a man I'd never seen before. "Secretary Marsh," Dad said, obviously familiar with the man. "Please come in." "I don't want to interrupt," Marsh said, "but I wanted to have a word with your daughter." "Of course." Dad looked at me. "Morgan, This is Victor Marsh, the new secretary of the enforcement department." "Hi," I said, uncertain if this man would be anything like Hart. Then I remembered Nick's endorsement of him and began to relax. "Would you mind stepping outside for a moment?" he asked me. "Sure." With a smile at my family, I left the room and stood in front of Marsh. "I've heard tremendous things about you, Morgan." I wondered how many of those things were actually about duplicate Morgan rather than me, but then I realized it didn't matter. I was here, not her. We chatted for a few minutes, then he said, "I just wanted to stop by and meet you before the press conference." He smiled. "We'll start in about 15 minutes. Nervousness made my heart pound, but I tried to stay focused on where I would be at the end of the day. Home. "Go ahead and wait with your family. Nick will come and get you when it's time." After 15 minutes, Nick came to get me. My family and I followed him as he led us into the lobby where the press conference would be held. When I saw all the people, so many that they spilled out of the lobby and into the large space outside, I was extra glad that my family was with me. "Morgan!" several people called out. My eyes went to their faces, and I saw that they were smiling. After all the hatred I'd faced from Hart and Holly, it was refreshing to know that other people I'd never even met, were happy to see me. Then I saw the signs. Multiple people who stood outside, and even a couple who were in the lobby, held signs that said things like, "Close the fat centers," and "We can take care of ourselves." Even more shocking, the enforcers who stood around were ignoring the signs. Before today, I would have expected them to destroy the signs and take the protesters into custody. My eyes went to Secretary Marsh as he approached the microphone, and I began to understand why Nick liked him. Maybe things would be different now. The idea gave me great hope and comfort. "You can stand over here," Nick said. "Marsh will let you know when it's time for you to talk." "Okay." "Good afternoon," Marsh said as he stood at the podium. "Thank you for coming here today." I looked at the media gathered near Marsh and saw Jessica Walker standing near the front. I smiled, thankful for the help she'd given me, particularly grateful that she'd shown up in the lobby days before when Hart had been about to drag me away. Marsh talked about the changes that had happened over the last few days, including Hart's arrest, which elicited cheers from the crowd. After announcing he wouldn't be taking any questions, he began talking about me. "As you're well aware," he said, "it is only due to one person that we were warned in time about the nefarious plans of Russell Hart. Thank you, Morgan Campbell." The crowd cheered loudly, which stunned me. "Because of Morgan's sacrifice to bring us that critical information, at this time I have been authorized to offer her a full pardon for any and all offenses, real and imagined, that she has been accused of, effective immediately." At that, the crowd broke into even louder cheers and whistles. Overwhelmed by the support of complete strangers, I felt tears fill my eyes. "Morgan," Marsh said as he looked at me, "would you like to say a few words?" All I really wanted was to go home and leave the nightmarish weeks behind me, but I knew I was expected to say something, and I made my way to the microphone. "Hello," I said, and the crowd cheered again. Their energy was contagious, and I found myself gaining confidence. "First off, thank you, Secretary Marsh, for the pardon." A wide grin curved my lips. "I accept." The crowd loved that and cheered some more. When they quieted down, I continued. "While I appreciate all the accolades, I'm not the only one who deserves credit. My good friend Nick," I gestured to him as he stood off to the side, "he deserves as much credit, if not more, than I do." The crowd applauded and Nick nodded to them. "I also want to thank my sister Amy and my good friend Falcon." The crowd applauded and cheered. "But the main thing I want to say to you today is how glad I am to see how many of you think that things need to change." A loud cheer went up at that. "I don't know what's going to happen, but just the fact that you're speaking out against the way things are gives me hope." I met the eyes of several people and strong emotion overcame me. "Thank you so much for supporting me." I pressed my lips together to hold back the sob that wanted to burst forth. "If it wasn't for all of you, I would still be locked in a room by myself, waiting to face torture and pain by the people who were in charge." I took a deep breath to calm myself. "So, thank you." I smiled, then stepped away from the mic. I could see tears in the eyes of those standing in the front, and I knew my story had touched them. "Thank you, Morgan," Marsh said. "We appreciate you and all you've done." The crowd cheered again, even louder if that was possible. While Amy and I had been in hiding and on the run, it had seemed that almost no one had truly cared about us and what happened to us. In fact, it had seemed that most people were against us. The warmth and support of the people in the room was like a balm to those feelings, and as I looked at their faces, peace settled over me like a soft blanket, and I knew there was hope for us, for all of us. Chapter 56. After the press conference, I managed to find some time to talk to Falcon in private. "You were awesome up there," he said. "Thank you." I was glad it was over with and that I could finally go home. "What's going to happen to you now, Falcon?" "What do you mean?" "Is your brother going to let you live with him?" He laughed. "Oh yeah, that's no problem." "But I thought he was on your father's side." Falcon shrugged. "He told our father that, but I don't think he really cares one way or the other. He's cool with me living with him." I wondered how Falcon really felt about what was happening with his father. "Do you think your father will go to prison?" "He has to pay for what he did." Falcon's face darkened with anger. "I mean, I was there, Raven." His voice intensified. "He let her do that to you. He didn't even care." He shook his head. "When I saw you..." His jaw tightened. "I wanted to kill him." I knew how he felt, because I'd felt the same thing toward Holly after she'd shocked Amy. "It probably looked a lot worse than it really was," I said. I didn't know if that was true, but there was no reason now to stoke the fire of his hatred toward his father. Falcon's face softened. "I'm just glad you're out now, and free." "Me too. So glad." He smiled. "I'm starting back at my job tomorrow." "They didn't fire you for missing work?" "Not after they found out why." "That's great." "Yeah, it's a good job, and I like it." Nick walked up to us. "Hey, I wanted to talk to the two of you for a minute." "What's up?" Falcon asked. "I just wanted to make it clear," he said as he looked at me, "that even though I told you I would wait to release the proof until you were all safe, once I found out you'd been captured, I decided it would probably be beneficial to you if that information got out right away." "You were right," I said, understanding that he was trying to say that he hadn't lied to me or tricked me. "I'm glad you did it." He smiled. "Good." He patted both Falcon and me on the shoulder, then he walked away. Falcon and I chatted for a while longer, and then I looked at my parents and saw that they were ready to leave. "Looks like it's time to go home." The word felt almost foreign in my mouth, but it tasted wonderful. "I should get going too." He smiled at me. I didn't know when I would see him next, but I knew we had a special bond and that we would always be friends. "Thank you, Falcon, for everything." "Anytime, Raven." He drew me into a hug, then he turned and strode toward the door. As I watched the boy with the cool name and crystal blue eyes walk away, I wondered what would have happened to Amy and me if we hadn't met him. "Ready to go home?" Dad asked as he put his arm around me. I lay my head against his shoulder. "Yes." I spent the rest of the evening with my family, enjoying their company more than I'd ever enjoyed it before. That night, as Amy and I lay in our beds in the room we shared, we rehashed all that had happened. It was hard to believe what we'd been through, what I'd been through. "You're so brave, Morgan," Amy said. "When I told Holly that I want to be just like you, I meant it." Flattered, I wanted her to understand that she didn't need to be like me. She was perfect just as she was. "Do you even realize how brave you are?" "I guess," she said in the dark. "But you were the one they were after. You were the one they wanted to hurt. Even so, you did everything you could to do what was right. I think that's awesome." I thought about all that had happened and realized that, yeah, I'd actually had my moments. I'd faced the most frightening challenges I'd ever faced in my life, and I'd survived. I'd even made a difference. Finally believing that I was more like duplicate Morgan than I'd given myself credit for, I smiled. Then I snuggled into my covers, safe and secure in my own bed, Finally home. Home with my family. Happy with myself and who I'd become. This has been Dare to Prevail Part 4, Parallel World, Book 5. Written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Copyright 2014 by Christine Kersey. Thanks for listening.